Hey everyone, this is Guilherme Peta from the Geopolitical Mundial channel here. Well, by now you guys must already be at this stage of the game. Given that the United States and Israel's conflict with Iran was a political disaster, we can't get anything positive out of this conflict politically, maybe economically, maybe, okay? But let's leave that for another video. Now, politically, there's nothing to say. This war was a disaster, okay? And what's more, I still hear a lot of people saying that at least the Iranians didn't develop the atomic bomb. Just imagine a country like Iran developing an atomic bomb. So, sure, it was a disaster, everything was bad, but at least that was prevented. Is it really that simple? And what if the Iranians had developed an atomic bomb? Is it really the way people think? I'm already telling you in advance that it's not, but let's look at this in more detail in today's video. But before we start, guys, it's that old story that every YouTuber here on YouTube always says, subscribe to the channel and share, okay? That helps a lot, even if it doesn't seem like it. It might sound cheesy to keep repeating this, so I won't. My name is Guilherme Peta, and this is the Geopolitical Mundial channel. The statement that has been repeated the most by many people to justify the American attack on Iran is that, at least despite all the damage, they prevented the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons. Just imagine a state that supports terrorism having nuclear weapons, and to be very clear, that's a dumb statement. First, which countries that have directly or indirectly supported terrorism already have nuclear weapons? Yes, there are nuclear-armed countries that have in some way helped terrorist groups, and they've been doing it for a long time. And even so, these countries haven't given nuclear weapons to terrorists, nor have they started shooting at each other. Among them, the former Soviet Union, which sponsored, trained, sheltered, and equipped terrorist groups. But, okay, technically that's a country that doesn't exist anymore. Let's discuss the countries still in the game today, starting with Pakistan. A practically failed state that, despite being nuclear-armed, deliberately gave support to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. For many, many years, and even today, it still has a very strange association with terrorist groups. But we have others who, at the very least, gave indirect support, like the United States itself, France, and even Israel. And yes, if this statement shocks you, it's probably because you didn't want to know the whole story. Because during the Arab Spring, these three countries systematically supported the forces of Al-Qaeda and ISIS against the regimes of Gaddafi in Libya and Assad in Syria. And is this well documented, or has it also been publicly stated by authorities? So, I'm sorry if you don't believe it, but it's not a matter of choosing to believe or not, you just have to accept it as a fact. So, if your concern is whether any state that finances terrorism has nuclear weapons, well, I'm sorry, but that has already happened. What really matters here realistically is deciding which terrorist group you like more. Because, besides the obvious fact that Iran systematically uses groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas to attack other countries in the region, several other countries besides Iran have also used this technique. Which brings us to the next question: was Iran developing nuclear weapons? And, well, it's complicated because the evidence is confusing, because in April 2024 I made this video talking about Iran's strength, and a lot of people who aren't experts and are used to getting information from channels that lean one way or the other. They stated in the comments that Iran had already secretly developed nuclear weapons, and I was very clear in responding that no, and well, 2 years later, it turned out I was right. Iran didn't have an atomic bomb, and the reason for that is very simple. I based this on carefully gathered data and information. That's why it takes me so many days to post a single video here on the channel and not 3 or 4 videos a day. Now, was Iran developing nuclear weapons? We have a factor to consider. The Ayatollah's leadership had a religious interpretation of the Quran that they shouldn't develop nuclear weapons. In the Western Hemisphere, we are used to religious rhetoric that draws on that kind of religious authority and is often misleading when politicians use it. But it's a mistake to think that it's like this everywhere in the world. The religious factor in Iran should not be underestimated or understood superficially as just another form of manipulation. It's much more complicated than that. During the Iran-Iraq War, for example, even while suffering heavy chemical attacks, the Iranians, having the chemical capability to retaliate, never did so because of this religious condemnation. This is not proof that they aren't developing nuclear weapons now, but it is an indication of their current intentions regarding developing nuclear weapons. Today, the most honest answer is that there is no public or conclusive proof of this. In 2025, the IAEA stated that there isn't. There were no indications of a structured and undeclared nuclear program underway in Iran. And US intelligence was even more explicit in its annual assessment of 2025. It clearly stated that it continued to assess that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon and that the supreme leader had not reauthorized the nuclear weapons program, which was suspended in 2003. Now, folks, you saw there that the CIA report mentioned that no, Iran was not heading toward developing a nuclear weapon. There was no evidence of that. The CIA, that's no small thing. Considering what the CIA is, it's an agency of espionage and counter-espionage, intelligence and counterintelligence. But few people know that this kind of service isn't restricted only to governments. If you have a company or you have some issue to solve, some problem that needs this kind of service, the private sector also has it. And that's why this video is sponsored by BCI. Get in touch with BCI. If you have a company, need to do an audit, need to do market analysis, need risk consulting, need to do an audit. If you were the victim of a rival company that went there and stole your data, get in touch with BCI. And if you are an individual and you are also having problems with information gathering, need to solve some kind of problem that only an intelligence agency could solve, get in touch with BCI as well. I'll put their contact info in the video description. But this doesn't absolve Iran because even in 2025 the IAEA concluded that there was a structured, undeclared program until at least the early 2000s. And that part of the materials and equipment from this program was kept after that, and that there are still undeclared nuclear materials and unanswered questions, but that's it, an empty space. That's why the IAEA board considered Iran to be non-compliant with its safeguards obligations in 2025. But making it clear that there was no evidence that they were developing nuclear weapons. But there's another factor, which is the China and Russia factor. The Chinese and Russians closely monitor the Iranian nuclear program, even more closely than the IAEA does. And very closely. In fact, Russian scientists and engineers have monitored the nuclear program from inside some of the Iranian facilities. And also, let me be clear again, if they detected that Iran was developing nuclear weapons, they would stop it, of course, for those who think the world is divided into two sides, into blocks. Okay, that doesn't mean anything, but in real life, take this very seriously. Those who have nuclear weapons don't want anyone else to have them, especially if it's a neighbor. China and Russia don't see Iran as a friend in the romantic or civilizational sense of the word. What exists between the three is, above all, a strategic convergence rooted in shared opposition. They all reject American pressure, the sanctions architecture led by Washington, and the military and political presence of the United States in regions they consider sensitive to their interests. This convergence is real, but it should not be confused with full trust, an organic alliance, or a merging of interests. The very agreement signed between Russia and Iran in January 2025 deepened military, energy, and intelligence cooperation, but it did not include mutual defense. That's something the Russians signed with North Korea, for example. And that matters a lot because it shows the nature of the bond. Moscow and Tehran cooperate, but they preserve their autonomy and avoid tying themselves to an automatic defense commitment with China. The logic is also similar. Beijing maintains a broad strategic partnership with Iran, buys huge volumes of Iranian oil, and diplomatically supports the need for a negotiated solution to the nuclear issue. But at the same time, it balances that against much larger interests in the Arab Gulf. In 2025, for example, China recorded trade of about $108 billion with Saudi Arabia, and another $108 billion with the United Arab Emirates, compared to only $41 billion with Iran. In other words, for Beijing, Iran is useful against the American presence in the region, but it is not the center of the regional chessboard. That's precisely why neither Russia nor China has any real interest in seeing another autonomous, ideologically assertive nuclear power emerge so close to Iran. The Chinese are infidels, atheists, but they're not a problem today because they support them due to the convergence I mentioned. And the Russians, seen as another form of imperialism alternative to the West, but for now, they're occupied with the same enemy that the Iranians would have in March 2025, China and Russia officially declared, together with Iran, that they welcomed the Iranian reaffirmation that its program was exclusively peaceful. And they supported the continuation of cooperation with the IAEA, reaffirming the framework in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty later in June 2025. Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, publicly said that Moscow wanted Iran to continue cooperating with the IAEA. So, get it into your head once and for all, established nuclear powers tend to be deeply conservative when it comes to proliferation near their areas of interest. China is the country with the most neighbors possessing nuclear weapons. There are 4, and it definitely doesn't need or want there to be 5. So, no, Iran was not going to develop nuclear weapons, partly because the old leadership wanted to, and interestingly, it was precisely those who had the most members killed by the Americans and Israelis. So, maybe that will even change in the future, but also partly because its leading partners, Moscow and Beijing, wouldn't allow it. And that's where the question comes in. What if, by any chance, Iran developed nuclear weapons and caught everyone by surprise? Understand that this wouldn't be a problem for the United States, especially for the United States, focused on its areas of geopolitical priority, the Arctic, the Americas, and the Pacific. The anti-American rhetoric of Iranian leaders stems from the fact that the Americans are there all around Iran. If they leave, Iranian rhetoric will focus only on Israel and Saudi Arabia. And eventually, or rather inevitably, it would be directed either against Russia or against China, most likely against Russia. That's because a nuclear-armed Iran would change the regional balance, increase the risk of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, boost Tehran's margin of strategic autonomy, and reduce Moscow and Beijing's ability to manage the crisis through diplomatic and economic means. But the worst scenario is for Russia, because that would mean more competition in the Caspian, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and along Russia's energy routes. However, with this attack by the United States, which I don't see, for now, as being able to come out victorious from this war, because you have to understand that war is not a sporting event, where the winner is the one who scores the most points. Killing or destroying more military equipment, war is politics by other means. If your political objective is not achieved, you do not come out victorious no matter how much you attack the enemy's military capability. And in this case, it seems that Washington doesn't even have an actual objective. Because if you're even a little bit honest, you'll see how, in the span of a month, the objectives stated by the White House have changed several times. But even with the Americans not being victorious, one thing is a fact. The United States caused enormous material damage to the Iranians, and I mean really enormous. And what's going to happen now is that Iran has been pushed into the position of a client state of Russia and China, becoming a link of mutual dependence between the two countries, who, instead of seeing a competitor, now have a key client. China is going to profit a lot by rebuilding Iran, probably rearming them. Russia will follow in this direction, although profiting less, but also getting post-war spoils. And will continue using Iran as a tool of pressure against the Saudis and the Turks. Those two are indeed Russia's real rivals in the Middle East region. The United States, no matter how much they manage to destroy Iranian military equipment and infrastructure, there won't be a real victory, and the Iranians will boast about having resisted the greatest military force on the planet. They will come out in shambles, but with a sense of moral victory. Russia and China will ultimately benefit most in the future. If you follow the channel, you know they are already gaining from this crisis and will profit even more afterward. The Russian interest in a scenario where Iran is weakened would be, above all, to prevent the area south of the Russian landmass and south of the Eurasian sphere from becoming a strategic vacuum captured by rivals. Moscow's main logic is not to save Iran out of friendship, nor necessarily to rebuild it as a full-fledged power, but to prevent Iranian erosion from opening a corridor for uncontrolled Western, Turkish, jihadist, or Chinese penetration. Over the strip that goes from the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, from the Caspian to Central Asia, and from there to the Hindu Kush and Hormuz access points. Russia's main interest is stabilizing the southern flank of the post-Soviet space. To the south of Russia lies the Great Eurasian Steppe, but this steppe does not end there. It connects to the Caspian, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Iran, when strong, acts in part as a buffer, a regional pole that helps contain the disorder coming from deep in the Middle East. If Iran becomes too weak, Moscow starts to fear not just the loss of a partner, but mainly the spillover of instability, Sunni insurgency, trafficking, weapons, mercenaries, uncontrolled migration, and ideological infiltration. They could end up reaching Azerbaijan, Dagestan, Chechnya, Georgia, Central Asia, and even the Volga. In other words, the problem for Moscow isn't just Tehran falling, it's the fire. To cross the geographic compartments and reach the southern belt of Russia itself. In addition, the Russians will block Turkish expansion in the Caucasus Central Asian arc. Here, many people imagine that the weakening of Iran would automatically favor the United States or Israel, but that's a short-sighted view amid a partial vacuum in Iran. One of the most agile actors to advance would be Turkey, precisely because of its position between the Bosphorus, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Turkic Ottoman world of Central Asia. If Iran loses influence in the south of the Caucasus and the south of the Caspian, Ankara gains room to expand political, military, energy, and cultural corridors beyond Azerbaijan, reaching the Caspian Sea and the Turkic-speaking republics. Can Moscow tolerate Turkish influence? What it doesn't want is a regional architecture where Turkey becomes the dominant bridge between the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, eroding Russian influence in the continental interior. And now, with Iran weakening, Russia will try to increase its role as a regional arbiter. This might be a more typically Russian move when Moscow can't fully dominate a region. It tries to become an indispensable armed mediator, a provider of guarantees, a supplier of weapons, a diplomatic bridge, and a source of veto protection at the United Nations. With Iran wounded but not destroyed, Russia will simultaneously sell itself as an interlocutor to Tehran, to parts of the Gulf countries, to Turkey, to Caucasian actors, and to Central Asia. Not because it has the strength to impose a complete order, but because relative chaos increases the value of those who can talk to everyone. It's the old Russian logic of turning material limitations into diplomatic and military centrality. China no longer sees the region mainly as an invasion frontier, but as a space for transit, supply, and long-term strategic shielding. China's first major interest would be to ensure energy continuity without total submission to the maritime system, which is currently controlled by American naval power. This is the core issue. The region connects Hormuz, the Gulf of Aden, Suez, Central Asia, and the Eurasian interior. For the Chinese, the structural problem is their deep dependence on energy and trade flows, which pass through these vulnerable choke points. If Iran weakens, Beijing doesn't just want to buy cheap oil. It wants to prevent the space between the Gulf, Central Asia, and Western China from falling under the exclusive control of pro-American forces, or into chronic chaos. In other words, China wants to make sure that Iran's weakening doesn't translate into greater Chinese vulnerability. China is going to turn this Iranian vacuum into an opportunity for economic and infrastructural penetration. China tends to step in where states are left wounded, as long as there is still some minimum level of order for contracts, routes, projects, and guarantees. A weakened but not collapsed Iran will become even more dependent on foreign capital, technology, imports, hydrocarbons, logistical infrastructure, and diplomatic protection. That's exactly where Beijing likes to operate. It doesn't need to formally control the territory, it just needs to make it increasingly integrated into the financing, supply, and distribution chains linked to China. So, in a scenario where Iran has been weakened, one of the main interests of the Chinese would be to turn Iranian fragility into asymmetric dependence. They will try to tie the Iranian space to the logic of the continental corridors of Eurasia, because Iran is not just the Middle East, it is also a connecting piece to Central Asia, the Caspian, the Hindu Kush, the Gulf, and the direction of the subcontinent. For China, this is geopolitical gold. A weakened Iran can become more accessible as the land link between Western China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Beijing sees the chance to expand or consolidate corridors that reduce dependence on purely maritime routes. This doesn't mean replacing the sea with land. That would be an exaggeration, but it means creating strategic redundancy, and strategic redundancy is something the Chinese love. Multiple routes, multiple suppliers, multiple partners, multiple countries dependent on them, and multiple means of pressure against rivals. And Beijing will also take on part of the role of economic guarantor, where the United States is perceived as militarily destructive and politically unreliable. And that's a very Chinese move. If Washington bombs, pressures, threatens, punishes, and strains its relationship with allies by prioritizing Israel, Beijing appears as an actor with a cooler tone. Trade, reconstruction, investment, oil purchases, political and diplomatic neutrality, no formal interference. The logic is simple. Americans destroy, Chinese build. This will be very attractive to the regimes in the region, especially the monarchies and pragmatic states, who want economic protection without ideological lectures, and who feel betrayed by the Americans, who prioritize the defense of Israel at their expense. So, first, China and Russia are following and monitoring the Iranian nuclear program and will not tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons. But what if, even so, by some twist of fate, that happened? That would be much more of a problem of increased competition between Russia, China, and Iran than a problem for the United States, which is safe and sound across the Pacific and Atlantic, very far from Eurasia. However, what the Americans are actually managing to do is make Iran an actor dependent on Russia and China, at the cost of the trust of allies like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and the NATO members. They are creating an organic alliance built on dependence, in a region that traditionally and historically has always pushed the countries in the area into very fierce competition among themselves. Of all the conflicts the Americans have been involved in, this was by far the most foolish of them. This level of complexity, this chaotic chessboard, doesn't fit into the minds of those who divide the world into one side or the other, between democracies and dictatorships, between the West and the East. And even worse, it makes even less sense to those who think that Israel is an ally of the United States or the West, when in fact we have historically seen that it is Israel that has used the United States as a pawn to be worn down. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and the way we discuss things. You notice that the approach isn't as simple as people think. We can never forget that in geopolitics the most important part is geography. And that's what most geopolitics analysts who work with geopolitics keep forgetting, the geographic part, which is the most fundamental part. So I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you noticed. I shaved my head actually. By now my hair has grown a little, but I had shaved it and it was completely bald. This new Guilherme Peta style in 2026 is going to be this Guilherme Peta style. Buddhist monk, kind of Zen. After all, I'm such a calm, laid-back, serene guy, so I decided to go for a more Buddhist monk style. Tell me what you think. But now I'm gonna let my hair grow out. I'm gonna grow into a metalhead look, because I also like metal, it's just that my hair is bad. It doesn't fall, it doesn't grow down long like a metalhead's, it grows out and ends up looking like Lion-O from Thundercats. The irony of fate. But anyway, that's it. Thank you very much everyone, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe if you really like the channel, become a member. That thing I always keep telling you guys, you might not think so, but it really helps a lot, okay? And thank you all so much for watching this video. Take care, and see you in the next video.